story of Jephthah and his vow has intrigued and puzzled Bible readers for probably for centuries. Overall, we need to bear in mind the comment that we have in the book of Hebrews about this man, where we're told that in a list of other noble men, it says, he became mighty in war and put foreign armies to flight. So he's there in that list of people of faith, alongside Gideon and people like that, as an example of somebody who we should copy as an example of a man who put his faith in God. So he goes down in God's book as a great man. And that's something we must remember before we start thinking about him. It's a fact, as we just read a few minutes ago, that Jephthah had a bad start in life. He was the son of an unknown man called Gilead. We don't know who this Gilead was, no background to him, who had an ordinary wife and had many sons, but he also had this son Jephthah by a harlot, it says in verse 1, a prostitute. So he was only a half-brother to all the other sons of the Gilead himself. And when Gilead died, not surprisingly perhaps, in verse 2, they thrust him out. They said, you're not going to inherit along with us. You're not a genuine son of Gilead and his wife. So he had to run away, and he fled, it says in verse 3, to the land of Tob. I'm not quite sure that's how you pronounce it, but it sounds like Tob. Well, I'm sorry, I've gone backwards and forwards there. We're not quite sure where Tob it was, but it's thought to be somewhere up in the north-east there. On the map, that's in Syria today. And that's Gilead, where the big dot is down the bottom there. So right up next to the Sea of Galilee, somewhere over on the right there, is a place called, we think it's probably called Tob. It's mentioned only in one other place in the Bible, that's in the 2nd of Samuel, and there it's called Ishtob, so maybe it's not in the same place. But it is associated with Syria there, so that's important. Anyway, he's somewhere up there in the north. But now trouble comes to the inhabitants of the region of Gilead. Because, as you see, it says in verse 5, the children of Ammon made war against Israel. Now, if we look at the map again, I'm sorry, I didn't label those, did I? Yes, there's Mizpah in Gilead, and there's Tob question mark somewhere up there. Okay? So, the next stage is that Ammon, people of Ammon, attack Israel. Now, you see from the map that Ammon's on the right-hand side, the east side of the Jordan, in what we call Jordan today. And it was an area which was not occupied by Israel, and they are attacking Israel, particularly at first the people in Gilead itself, which is just to the right of the Jordan, but also it appears they went further over the Jordan as well and attacked the people on the west side of the Jordan. But the people of Gilead on the east side next to Ammon are the ones who are in the firing line. And faced with this crisis and lacking any sort of military structure, the Gileadites swallow their pride and invite Jephthah to come back from his exile, because up there in Tob, it tells you in verse 3, he'd assembled around himself a gang of warriors. It calls them vain men, outlaws. I suppose the nearest equivalent we have will be Robin Hood and his outlaws in the forest of Nottingham, or wherever you think Sherwood Forest was. But anyway, something like that. He gathered to himself various people who were, for one reason or another, outlaws, and they went out with him, it says. So here was a ready-made mini army that they could call on to come down and rescue them from the Ammonites. And they promised him, in verse 8, that if he did do this, if he came back to fight for them, then he would be their head. Verse 8 says, you will be our head over all the inhabitants of Gilead. Well, he's a bit hesitant at first, because he's not quite sure whether they really mean what they say. And so verse 9, he says, if you do bring me home to fight against the children of Ammon, and the Lord delivers me before me, will I be your head? So he's asking them to confirm that he will be their head. And they said, yes, verse 10, the Lord be witness between us. They take an oath. They swear an oath by the name of the Lord, if we do not do so according to your word. If you win the battle, we will definitely make you our head. Notice there in verse 9 that Jephthah is saying, if the Lord delivers them before me. So you see already there a little hint that he believes the outcome of the battle is going to be in the hands of God. And so he extracts from this oath of allegiance. And just to read the end of verse 11, where we finished reading, it says in the Authorised Version, he uttered all his words before the Lord in Mizpah. Now, Mizpah is probably the site of the tabernacle at this period of the Judges. If you like, just quickly to go over to Judges chapter 20, for example. Judges 20 and the first verse, you'll see all the children of Israel went out, and the congregation was gathered together as one man from Dan to Beersheba with the land of Gilead unto the Lord in Mizpah. So if you wanted to go to the Lord, you went to Mizpah. So that's evidently where the tabernacle was pitched. It's also 1 Samuel 7 verse 6 says much the same thing. It is possible, by the way, to be truthful, it is possible there was another Mizpah on the west side of Jordan, but the original Mizpah was definitely east of Jordan, because it was from Mizpah, if you remember your Genesis history well, it was from Mizpah that Jacob said goodbye to Laban. And that's the place where they parted, where they built that monument of stones. So the original Mizpah is definitely east of Jordan, and that seems to be where he went to pray, it says, utter his words before the Lord. Now, the Net Bible translates that like this. Jephthah repeated the terms of the agreement before the Lord in Mizpah. So again, we can see he's a man who believes in the Lord. The Lord's going to give the outcome of the battle, and to get these people to confirm their oath, he takes them off to Mizpah and he makes them swear the oath before the Lord, to repeat it all before the Lord in Mizpah, presumably then at the tabernacle. So Jephthah's now in charge of the army, his little army, and whatever he can gather together from the Gileadites to go and fight with him. And following the instructions that we have in the law of Moses about the conduct of wars, before he sets off into battle, he first enters into dialogue with the king of the enemy. Let's go to Deuteronomy 20, just to pick that point up, please. Deuteronomy 20, verse 10. Come in with me to this one. Deuteronomy 20, verse 10. When thou comest nigh unto a city to fight against it, Moses says, then proclaim peace unto it, and it shall be, if it make thee an answer of peace, and open unto thee, all the people shall be tributaries, and shall serve thee. And if it make no peace with thee, but will make war against thee, then thou shalt besiege it. And when the Lord delivers it into thine hand, you slay every male. So that's what Jephthah's now going to do. He goes to the king of the Ammonites with a messenger, verse 12 of our chapter. He sends messengers to the king of the children of Ammon, saying, why have you come against my land? It's what we might call a parley. Before any fighting begins, he wants to make it quite clear what the grounds of the Ammonites' complaints are. And he says, why are you coming to attack Israel? Well, the king of Ammon, who's not named, by the way, there's no name given to him, usually perhaps in the Old Testament, he replies to this messenger and says, it's your fault. It's your Israelites' fault. He says, you seized our lands, and I'm only fighting to get them back. That's what he's saying, briefly. I'm only fighting to get my lands back from Israel. Now, Jephthah, if you read on through chapter 11, you'll find he immediately repudiates that story, that description of what happened. And verse 14 of our chapter, Jephthah sent messengers again unto the king of the children of Ammon, and says, Israel took not away the land of Moab and the land of the children of Ammon. It's not true. We didn't take your lands. When Israel came up from Egypt, verse 17, we wanted to go through your land, the king of Edom first of all, and then verse 19, the Amorites, and then Sihon. And all we wanted to do was pass through your land. We didn't actually possess it. And so, in verse 23, the Lord God of Israel dispossessed the Amorites from before his people. And why will you come and possess our land, which we've taken from the Amorites? Our God will drive out from before us. Whosoever the Lord our God shall drive out before us, then will we possess. And verse 26, he says, and this is the crunch point, we've been here for 300 years, he says. 300 years, he says. Why, therefore, did you not recover them within that time? Have you suddenly decided that you took our land away from Ammon, and now you've come to get it back? We've been here for 300 years. So, no, your story isn't correct. We have not sinned against you, verse 27. You do wrong to war against me, says Jephthah. The Lord, the God of Israel, the Lord the judge be judged this day between the children of Israel and the children of Ammon. And that's absolutely true. If you go back to the record in Deuteronomy or Numbers, Israel specifically avoided the lands of Edom, Moab and Ammon. They only took land to the north of the Arnon River, which was the territory of Ammon. And their victories were given to them by God, who drove out Sihon, king of the Amorites, and all the other people to the north there. So Jephthah calls now on Israel's God, Yahweh, to judge the situation. That's what we read in verse 27. The Lord, the judge, be judged this day. But the unnamed enemy king makes no reply to this second letter from Jephthah, and he gets busy to start fighting Israel. So Jephthah's followed the instructions of the law. First, talk with the enemy, see if they can make peace. Only if they can't make peace, then get on and attack them. And God says he will be with you in the battle. And also we've noticed too, haven't we, that Jephthah has a very good knowledge of his nation's history. Going back hundreds of years, 300 years. He knew exactly what happened when Israel came out of Egypt and Moses led them on the east side of Jordan, eventually up to the territory of Sihon, king of the Amorites. And he could recall that and recount it to Ammon, countering his suggestion that they'd taken the land away from the Ammonites, because they didn't. And he knows the history of his people. So here's a man who knows his Bible. He's been well taught by his father, Gilead. He had his father with him all the time until his father died. He's obviously been brought up to know the history of Israel and to worship and believe in the God of Israel, to the extent that he now sees the outcome of the coming battle as being in the hands of the God of Israel. Well, at this point in the story, the Spirit of the Lord falls upon Jephthah, just as it had done before on people like Gideon and Barak. Where have we got the verse there, so we can find it? Verse 29. Verse 29. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah, and he passed over Gilead and Manasseh, and passed over unto the children of Ammon. The Net Bible says, the Lord's Spirit empowered Jephthah. Quite a neat translation. So now something's happened to Jephthah himself. The Spirit of the Lord's come upon him. He's strengthened, and like all those other great judges before him, he's now going to set off for battle with God's power inside him. And he now sets off on this long journey on to the tribes east of Jordan. That's Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, recruiting men to try to come to follow him. Verse 29, he passed over Gilead, Manasseh, and from Manasseh or Gilead he passed over to the children of Ammon. Now, at this point, we're going to peep ahead to chapter 12 and the first 3 verses. Because here we find something that he doesn't tell you in chapter 11. And this is after the battle's all over. We know, of course, we know our Bible history. We know Jephthah won the battle. But look at chapter 12, verse 1. The men of Ephraim, where would you find Ephraim on the map? Look at the map, it's on the wall. Ephraim's over here. The men of Ephraim, that's on the west side of Jordan, said to Jephthah in verse 1, why did you pass over to fight against the children of Ammon and didn't call us to go with you? We will burn your house upon you with fire. Now, how does Jephthah reply? Verse 2. I and my people were at great strife with the children of Ammon, and when I called you, you delivered me not out of their hands. And when I saw that you delivered me not, I put my life in my hands and passed over against the children of Ammon. So, it's pretty clear that in his recruiting campaign, Jephthah had actually gone over to the other side of Jordan to try and recruit helpers to come and help him fight. Oh, there he is, going around there. From the west, the tribe on the west, the Ephraimites, on the west side of the river. And they had said, no, we're not coming. You might think, well, that's a bit mean, really, because the Ammonites have been attacking the Ephraimites. Surely they should help Gilead to fight the Ammonites and get rid of the Ammonites. But no, they said, we're not coming. I suppose you could argue that over those 300 years, with that great big valley of the Jordan between Ephraim on the west and Gilead on the right, there was a division between the peoples, which had hardened perhaps, and they didn't feel as if they ought to follow this unknown rebel with his outlaws from somewhere called Tob. Why should we come and fight? We know that even the language had changed slightly, don't we? Because there's this business about the shibboleth, where they're speaking a different dialect on the Ephraimite side, the west side of Jordan, compared with the Gilead side where Jephthah came from. So perhaps those 300 years have caused some hard feeling between the two lots of Israel, the east and the west. Anyway, they said, no, we're not coming. Which you wouldn't know just reading chapter 11. It's only after the battle's over you discover that he had already asked them to come and they said no. So that leaves Jephthah with only those men he had been able to attract from the half tribe of Manasseh and from Gilead, a tiny force to go out and fight against the might of the Ammonites. So he is desperate. He is desperate. Chapter 12, verse 3, he says, I put my life in my hands. So it's at this point that he returns with his diminutive army to Mizpah, where they seem to have made a special stopover to worship the Lord. And there at Mizpah, Jephthah makes a vow to the Lord. He says, if you'll give me victory, I'll give back to you whatever you choose. Whatever you choose. Whatever comes out of my house when I return, I'm going to devote it to you. Now, Jephthah could have vowed his best bull, or a field, or 10% of the spoils of victory. Do you know, I think that's what Abraham did when he went off to fight against the men who had taken his nephew Lot away. He went off with a tiny force of 34 men, was it, something, to go and fight against the great army that had come all the way from Elam and down the side of Jordan, up the other side, taking Lot with them. When he came back to Jerusalem after the battle, what did he do? He went to Melchizedek, the priest, and he gave him 10% of the spoils. And I have a feeling that before we went on this expedition, Abraham too had said to God, give me the victory and I'll give you 10% of the spoil. Anyway, you can't prove that, but it seems to me a probability. So he made this vow, 10%, not 10%, but anything that comes out of my house, you choose, Lord, what it's going to be. David the king seems to have made similar vows too when he was facing great odds in battle. Have a look, for example, at Psalm 56, just to pick out one out of, well, you've got many examples actually in the Psalms of this, but Psalm 56, take an example from there. 51, 52, there we go. 56, and verse 9. Verse 9. When I cry unto thee, that's God, then shall mine enemies turn back. This I know, for God is for me. In God I will praise his word. In God, verse 11, I have put my trust. And here it is, verse 12. Thy vows are upon me, O God. I will render praises unto thee, for thou hast delivered my soul from death. And so he vows he has made a vow to return to God something in return for God's help in giving him the victory. Thy vows are upon me, O God, he says. Chapter 66 of Psalms. Psalm 66, verse 13. He's been talking about the fighting. Fire went through fire and water, verse 12. And thou, God, broughtest us out into a wealthy place, or margin says a moist place. Here it is, verse 13. Psalm 66, verse 13. I will go into thy house, temple, with burnt offerings. I will pay thee my vows, which my lips have uttered, and my mouth has spoken, when I was in trouble. So David going off to fight, and finding himself against great odds, going through fire and water, verse 12, had cried to God, and he promised God that when he got back, verse 15, if he got back safely, and the battle was won, I will offer unto thee burnt sacrifices of fatlings, incense of rams, bullocks, with goats. And no doubt David did that. When he got back safely from the battle, he did offer those sacrifices he had promised that he would make to God in return for God's help. So, what we're saying is it's not unprecedented that Jephthah makes this vow for God's help in a dire situation where he's got a tiny handful of men against a great army, and the people he trusted would come and help him from Ephraim said no. So he promised God whatever came first out of his house doors. Let's have a look at the vow more precisely in chapter 11 of Judges again. Go back to Judges, please, and chapter 11, verse 31. Here's the vow. Well, let's read verse 30 to pick it up. Verse 30. Jephthah vowed a vow. If thou, God, shalt without fail deliver the children of Ammon into mine hands, it shall be that whatsoever cometh forth of the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the children of Ammon shall surely be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. Now, if you've got an authorised version margin, you'll see it says, or I will offer it up for a burnt offering, which gives you two choices there. Something can be the Lord's, or it can be offered up for a burnt offering. The grammar allows for the emerging object to be either an animal or a person. It could have been Jephthah's favourite cow. It could have been his slave. The point is, he was leaving it to God to decide the value of his sacrifice. He didn't actually write it down beforehand, saying, I'm going to offer this. He said, you choose, Lord, whatever comes out of my house. Now, you have to bear in mind, of course, that in those days, houses were constructed where the animals lived on the first floor, the ground floor, that's right, yeah, the ground floor. It's called the first floor in Russia. On the ground floor, and the people lived on the next floor above. So the animals were housed underneath where the people lived. Handy in winter time because it keeps you warm, you see, from the animals' heat. So, in faith that God would now help him, Jephthah goes forth against the Ammonite house, and he was granted a resounding victory. In fact, the pursuit reached from a place called Aroah. It's in the next chapter, as we can find it. Verse 32. He passed over to the children of Ammon to fight. The Lord delivered them into his hand. There it is. And he smote them from Aroah, even until there cometh to Minnith 20 cities, with a very great slaughter. Actually, you can work it out. It's about 30 miles range from the top to the bottom. The battlefield occupied something like 30 miles, 50 kilometres for the Russians. So it was a very great slaughter, just like Gideon when he went to attack the Midianites years before. In fact, the next translation there is even more graphic. It says, he wiped them out. He wiped them out. The Ammonites, he wiped them out. That's the Net Bible. The Hebrew text actually says that the Ammonites were humbled before the Israelites, which perhaps is putting it a bit more quietly. So, from that time onwards, there was no more oppression of the Israelites east of Jordan, and Jephthah could return in triumph to his base at Mizpah. Now, Jephthah's daughter had spent many anxious days while her father was away fighting the Ammonites. She knew it was an unequal contest, a tiny army against a great big one, and she didn't know there's no mobile phones, no Instagrams, none of that stuff, not even postage stamps and things. She didn't know if he was alive or dead. Can you think of a similar situation a bit later on in the Old Testament where somebody's desperate to know what's happened to his family, to his children, to his sons who are out fighting a battle? Come on. David, yes? Who was the father of David? Jesse, and he wanted to know what was happening to his sons. He sent David to find out whether his sons were still alive fighting against the Philistines. And David came back with a good message, of course. So it's like that. This little girl, I don't know how little she was. Actually, it's not a baby, this young lady. She's a grown girl, according to the Hebrew description of her. This girl does not know if her father's alive or dead. And then news comes through after the battle of a resounding victory which her father has led. Her father is now famous. He's delivered Israel. And when she heard he was coming home, she was determined to give him a great reception. Like Miriam in an earlier victory over the Egyptians, remember. she went out to meet her father with dancing and tambourines. Let's find it, verse 34. When Jephthah came to Mizpah, his daughter came out with timbrels and with dances. Israelites always love dancing. To this day they do, and every time you go to Israel you see them dancing. Especially in a situation like this of great happiness and triumph and glory because the battle's been won. So she goes out to meet her dad, strumming away on a little tambourine, and big smile all over her face. Let's see if we can find it. I've got it here somewhere on the picture. Oh yes, that's Jephthah making his vow. I'm sorry, I got left behind with my pictures. That's Jephthah in desperation making his vow to God to save him at Mizpah, the place presumably where the tabernacle was. And this is what we're seeing now. His little daughter comes out to meet him with her music and a big smile on her face. But when Jephthah saw his daughter emerge from the house, it says in verse 35, he rent his clothes. Now what's that a sign of for an Israelite, to rend your clothes?
Extreme distress.
Sorry?
Extreme distress.
Distress, yes, or could be sorrow, could be repentance or mourning. Yes, it's an extreme, it shows he's in extreme distress. That's a good way of putting it. So when he sees his daughter emerge from the front door, he actually rips his clothes apart. And he says in verse 35, alas, my daughter, you brought me very low. You're one of those that trouble me. I've opened my mouth to the Lord and I can't go back. He explains to his daughter why he's heartbroken, because he made a promise to God and couldn't go back on it, that whatever came out of his house first must go to the Lord. Now, Jephthah's little girl's reply is very impressive. Verse 36. My father, she says, if you have opened your mouth to the Lord, do to me according to that which proceeded out of your mouth, for as much as the Lord hath taken vengeance for thee of thine enemies. What she's saying is, if my life was to be the price of Israel's victory, I'm happy with that. But she makes one last request, to be given 2 months with her friends, to mourn the fact that she's never going to have children. Verse 37, let this thing be done 2 months, she says, that I may go up and down on the mountains and bewail my virginity. I'm never going to have a child. And so Jephthah agreed to that, and she never married a man. And it says at the end of the chapter that it was the custom of Israelite girls to commemorate this giving of herself to God by this little girl. They used to go and talk to her every month. Where is it? Verse 40. The daughters of Israel went yearly to lament, or the margin, the Authorized Version margin says to talk with the daughter of Jepthah the Gileadite for 4 days every year. They had a national little holiday for the ladies. They go and talk to, or go and lament what happened to Jepthah, the daughter of Jephthah's daughter. We don't know her name. Another interesting point, we don't know her name. They go and mourn what's happened to her. They recount the story. In fact, the word lament there in verse 40, they went to lament, is exactly the same word that we have in chapter 11, verse 40. Sorry, that's where I'm reading. In Judges chapter 5 and verse 11. Judges chapter 5 and verse 11, yeah. They that are delivered from the noise of archers in the place of drawing water, there shall they, and here it is, this is the word, there shall they rehearse the righteous acts of the Lord. Rehearse. To tell again the story. I suppose we have to assume that this annual commemoration of Jephthah's daughter died out after a while, because there's nothing we don't hear anything about it later on in the Bible. But it seems as if it happened for the years that followed her the taking, the vow being exacted. So now we come to the technical point. What exactly did Jephthah vow? And this topic, as we said before, provides perennial argument. One observation we need to make at the start is that Jephthah, in spite of his rather erratic origins, had clearly been brought up in the fear of the Lord. He had a very accurate knowledge of Israel's history. He insisted that if there was a victory, it would be God who would give the victory. and he committed his own campaign into the hands of the Lord. I think all those things show us that Gilead, his father, had taught him well. He was a godly man. In an age when the nation as a whole were worshipping idols, here's Jephthah, a believer in God, a man who stands out from the rest. That's the first point. He was a Bible believer. The second point, as we've already seen, he made his oath in a state of desperation. Those he could have expected to swell the ranks of his tiny army had turned him down. And so, like David and others before him, he was ready to show his gratitude for the victory through a sacrifice if God gave him the victory. And this is the point. So complete is his trust in God, he leaves God to decide what the sacrifice should be. And when it turned out to be the thing he treasured most of all in the world, his only daughter, he didn't turn back from keeping his promise. Many men would have conveniently forgotten their vow or tried to change the conditions retrospectively. But Jephthah was a man of his word. He'd made a promise, he's going to keep his promise. The question is, what exactly happened to this unnamed but heroic daughter? To supply a credible answer to this question, we have to turn to the chapter in Leviticus about vows. Because you know there's a whole chapter in Leviticus about vows. And that's where we need to go now. It's in chapter 27, please. Let's have a look at Leviticus chapter 27. It's come up on the screen. So, as it says at the beginning of the chapter, in verse 2, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say, when a man shall make," and here comes a singular vow. This is the first example. Now in this chapter we have a number of examples of different kinds of vows that you could make. You could choose what kind of vow you wanted to make. It was optional. You're not compelled to make a vow. That's the point about a vow. It's not compulsory. You haven't got to do it because of the law or because it's a time for the tribute or something. It's something you yourself personally are wishing to give to God for some reason. Probably because you're asking God's help. So there's a range of things you could choose from to give to God. And also we shall find at the end of the chapter there's some exceptions which were not to be used for making vows like this for very good reasons, which we'll see. So let's have a look at the first case. From verse 2 right down to verse 8 we have a situation where you could vow a person to God. Speak to the children of Israel. When a man shall make a singular vow, this means a vow of a person, the person's fault shall be by thy estimation. Now when it says thy, this book is Leviticus. It's a book that's written for the priests. So when it says thy, it means the priest. The priest, this is his instructions of what he's to do in this situation. A man's come to him, he wants to make a vow of a person, and the priest has to estimate the value of that person. And there's some rules. Verse 3. If the person's between 20 and 60, 50 shekels of silver. If it's a lady, verse 4, only 30 shekels, half price. Verse 5, if it's a child, from 5 years old to 20, only 20 shekels. And a female baby, a young lady, only 10 shekels. And if it's very tiny, a month old, 5 shekels and 3 shekels respectively. And if it's over 60, oh dear, this is our category. A male, 15 shekels, half price. And for the female, only 10 shekels. So I'm afraid the aged ladies don't get on very well. They're not worth very much according to the scale. Right. But then, even then, there's an escape clause in verse 8. If the man's too poor to pay that much money, then the priest can reduce it according to the ability of the man who's made the vow. If the priest can see it's impossible for him to pay 20 shekels, the priest can reduce it a bit because he's poor. So that's interesting, isn't it? That you vow the person, but you don't actually give the person to God. You give the value of the person to God, which the priest estimates, and you put the money in the priest's hand, giving that to God in the sense that it goes into the tabernacle or temple and helps us fund the resources of the tabernacle. So, yeah, in the Net Bible, verse 2. When a man makes a special votive offering based on the conversion value of persons to the Lord. That's the Net Bible. A man makes a votive offering based on the conversion value of persons to the Lord. And a person can be valued at different rates depending whether male, female, young or old, and so on. So that's a person. Now, let's go on to, let's put that on there. Yeah, a valuing person. Now, verses 9 and 10 cover the, verses 9 to 13 cover the dedication of an animal. And giving an animal as your vow. Verse 9. If it be a beast, by beast it means a domestic animal, whereof men bring an offering unto the Lord, then it has to be given to the Lord, and he can't alter it, he can't change it. Now, if it's a beast whereof men bring an offering, what category will that come into under the law of Moses? What kind of animal would it be? If it's one that can be used for an offering. Come on. A clean animal. Yes, it will be a clean animal. Like sheep, deer, goat, whatever. Not horses, not dogs, not pigs. A clean animal that can be offered as a sacrifice. And in that case, the animal itself is handed over. Full stop. There's no business about valuing it because the animal itself can be given to God. It's usable as an offering. But verse 11, if it's an unclean animal of which they do not offer a sacrifice to the Lord, he presents the beast and the priest values it. He works out what the animal's worth on the market and he says that's what you've got to pay. And that's the case of an unclean animal which can't be sacrificed. You could actually redeem it, have the same animal back again if you redeemed it with money. So, next we move in verse 14 and 15 to a house. You could vow your house. You could say before you set off the battle, Lord, if you give me the victory, I'll give you the value of my house. So in verse 14, the man sanctifies his house and the priest has to make his estimation. Now, that's not too difficult, I suppose. Look at the house agents or in the neighbourhood and see how much it's worth. And then you hand over to the Lord that value, that house, or if you want, verse 15, you can redeem the house with money and pay an extra 20% and you can keep the house, but you have to pay an extra 20% if you actually want to keep the house and not hand the house over to the tabernacle or temple. In verse 16 to 21, we've got land. You could vow land. Now this is complicated because, of course, land didn't belong to people. The land belonged to God. And the people only rented the land from God for a period of time. So every 50 years, if you had a bad time during that 50 years and you had to sell your land, it wasn't really your land, then the law said that you have your land back again at the end of 50 years, the Jubilee. So the value of a piece of land was only how many years were left from during which you could grow crops from it until the next Jubilee. So obviously if the Jubilee is coming up next year, the value of the land is very small because it's only worth 1 year's crop. If the Jubilee is 49 years away, then of course it's worth a lot more because you get a lot more crops from it. So in the case of inherited land like that, it's valued up to the next Jubilee and handed over or redeemed with money. Now, that's inherited land, but if, verse 22, you have a case here where the land you bought from somebody else. Now, if he bought the land from somebody else, it still belongs to his family in perpetuity. So, next Jubilee, it's got to go back to his family. So again, verse 22, verse 23, the priest has to value how much time is left to the year of Jubilee, and verse 24, when the Jubilee year comes, that field which you bought from somebody else returns to his family because it's his possession. So, different methods of vowing, people, animals, or even houses or land, the value is worked out by the priest, and he says that's how much you've got to hand over to God. Now we have, at the end of this chapter, some exceptions where you couldn't do that. You see, in most of those cases we looked at, except for the clean animal, which has to be handed over, the vowed personal object could be redeemed with money. But there were exceptions to that, because in verse 26, the firstling of an animal, firstborn, is the Lord's anyway, because all firstborn animals belong to God automatically. So you couldn't vow to give God a firstborn animal because it already belonged to God. So that's excluded there quite clearly in verse 26. And then you've got another situation in verse 28. And this is interesting. No, verse 28, notwithstanding, no devoted thing that a man shall devote unto the Lord of all that he hath, both a man, beast, field, shall be sold or redeemed. Every devoted thing is holy unto the Lord. Now, again, Net Bible translates devoted as permanently dedicated. Permanently dedicated by the offerer to the Lord out of his possessions. If it's in that category, it's devoted, you could not get it back by paying money. Right? Next in verse 20, where have we got to? Sorry. Verse 29. Another category here. None devoted which shall be devoted, RSV, from among men, shall be redeemed, but shall surely be put to death. Here's a category where people have been devoted to destruction. There was, excuse me, this is where, for example, the Amalekites, God sent Saul against the Amalekites, and they were devoted to destruction. He was told, he didn't, of course, but he's told to kill man, woman, and animals, everything, completely, wipe them out. Achan and all his family were devoted to destruction. They were destroyed. Not just Achan, but his wife, his children, and his animals. They all went dead. Actually, the Canaanites too, when they went into the land, were devoted to destruction. Everybody had to be put to death. So this is a category where there's no possibility of buying things back there because they've got to be killed. They've got to be killed because they've been devoted to destruction. So that gets rid of them. And lastly, in verse 30, we have tithes. All the tithe of the land, whether it be of seed of the land or fruits of trees, it's the Lord's. It's already the Lord's. It's holy to the Lord already because every tithe had to be given to God anyway. So you couldn't possibly devote a tithe to God as a vow because it belonged to him already. Those exceptions I think all make sense as long as we understand what it means here in verse 28 and 29. So let's go back to our friend Jepthah and his vow. Judges 11 verse 30 we read. Judges 11 verse 30. He said to God, if thou shalt without fail deliver the children of Ammon into mine hands, it shall be, whatever cometh out of my house shall surely be the Lord's, or I will offer it up for a burnt offering. So Jepthah had devoted to God whatever it was that came out of his house, and it could not be redeemed with money. He falls into the category in Leviticus 27 of verse 28, something that's devoted to the Lord, either of man or beast or field, and it can't be redeemed with money. It is most holy unto the Lord. And as we saw, the margin allows either that it should belong to the Lord or offered up as a burnt sacrifice. Now, we need to accept, don't we, that God does not accept human sacrifice. That's a very fundamental point of the law of Moses, right from the very beginning. Let's have a look at Deuteronomy 12, just to pick up how against human sacrifice God was. Deuteronomy 12:31. Thou shalt not do so. Thou shalt not do so to the Lord thy God. Every abomination to the Lord have they, that's the Canaanites, done unto their gods, for even their sons and daughters they have burnt in the fire to their gods. And God says that's an abomination, verse 31, an abomination to the Lord. Have a look at Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 31, a bit later on, of course, in the Old Testament, but same principle still standing there very clearly here, Jeremiah 7 and 31. This is talking about the valley of the Gehinnom. They have built the high places of Tophet in the valley of the sons of Hinnom, to burn their sons and daughters in the fire, which I commanded not, and neither came it into my heart, says God. So, offering a human sacrifice would not be acceptable. An animal, yes, but a human sacrifice would not be acceptable to God. So to devote to the Lord for a person as opposed to an animal would have to be to commit him or her to permanent sacrifice in the tabernacle or the temple. And the clearest example of such a thing is to be found in 1 Samuel chapter 1. Have a look again with me at 1 Samuel chapter 1. And you remember the vow that Hannah made to God. She wanted a baby. She desperately wanted a baby. And she made a vow to God. 1 Samuel 1:26. I am the woman that stood by thee here, praying unto the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has given me my petition which I asked of him. Therefore also, here it is, have I lent him to the Lord. As long as he liveth, he shall be lent to the Lord. So here we have a situation where this little baby was born as a result of a vow, and his mother had already said, when the time comes, he will be lent to the Lord. She was in desperation like Jephthah. She'd been nagged and nagged to tears by her rival wife Peninnah because she was infertile. So she makes this vow: if God opens my womb, my firstborn child will be given to God. And you remember how when he was somewhere like 3 or 4 years old, she handed over Samuel to Eli, the high priest, to spend all the rest of his days in the service of God. Actually, there are a few references in the Bible to suggest that women as well as men could be dedicated in the same way. Not as priests, of course, like Samuel was, but as helpers in the work of the holy place. And Exodus 38 might be one example of that if you've got time. Exodus 38 and verse 8, when they're busy building the tabernacle, in verse 8, he made the laver from the looking glasses of the women assembling, which assembled at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. So the whole group of women who assembled at the door of the tabernacle, they were there to help in the service of the Lord by working in perhaps menial ways to ensure the smooth running of the temple. And in the New Testament, in Luke chapter 7, you've got Luke chapter 2. Sorry, you've got Anna the prophetess, who became a widow, and for all the rest of her days, and there were a lot of them, years and years and years, she stayed day and night in the temple, serving God, praying to Him, and she devoted herself to God after her husband died and never married again. So, I think myself that's probably the most reasonable answer. That she was devoted to the Lord, as we read in that chapter in Leviticus, the chapter about vows, as somebody who was not to be put to death, because that's a different category. That's the Karem, where you're like the Canaanites and Achan and the Amalekites, they're devoted to destruction. She's devoted to the Lord to help and serve in the temple. So, in summary, we can say that Jephthah knew his Bible history. He certainly had faith in God. When his friends let him down, he had to take a vow in order to secure the help of God, and he left God to decide what the price would be. And when the price turned out to be his most precious possession, his little girl, he kept his promise. And so his vow committed his little daughter irrevocably to the service of God. She never married. He would never have a grandchild. In fact, if you read on, you'll find he only lived for 6 years after this. And then he died. Perhaps he died of a broken heart. I don't know. There it is. He committed his daughter to the service of God. That seems to be the most reasonable explanation for Jephthah's vow. Thank you.